First of all, I am Paula Brownlee, and it is such a pleasure to be with you. I'm really looking forward to this and interacting as much as is humanly possible on this Zoom meeting. So let's start with success. Our title is Vegetable Gardening for the Perplexed. The whole point is to go from the perplexed and puzzled to successful, satisfying vegetable gardening. I do want to just mention that both Deborah Abercrombie and I will be sharing this presentation in different ways. We think we've got a fairly smooth transition between us. And I'm just going to do a couple of slides at the beginning, and then I'm going to hand over to Deb and introduce her to you after you've done your first poll. So this is just a little bit of a glimpse of an in-ground garden, which I would say in June is very successful. Look at those lettuces in the foreground, 2 or 3 different kinds, probably Swiss chard. And if you look at the back, you can see just about some beans climbing a fence. Everything looks lush and doing beautifully. And this is the goal for all of us, all of you participants and us. We all want to have gardens that look something like this. But we don't only garden in ground. And if I could have this next slide, please. Sonia. We'll take a look at different kinds of gardens. Here we go. This is here, first look at the picture, a successful container garden, or as I like to just call them, plain old pots. These are pots in my world. And you can see here that they're smaller plants on the whole, but quite lush and vigorous. We've got some peppers in the front. We've got some really nice looking tomatoes ripening. It can't be June, it must be July, I should think by now, or even August perhaps. So the whole goal is to replace being perplexed. We're all perplexed from time to time, but the thing is you don't want to be constantly perplexed and puzzled. We want to replace that with success and access to ways to get over any intermittent problems. And my first thing, which you will hear me say every now and again, it's a personal Paula thing, learning to prowl the garden. And by that, I think the word prowl has an interesting connotation, but it's really appropriate for your whole property, not just your garden or your vegetable garden. You need to look at it all the time as a whole. What's appealing? What's good to you as you look at your whole property? What's good as you look at your vegetable garden as a whole? But when you're prowling, that also implies noticing, observing, and looking and in detail at your plants, looking at the leaves and if anything looks a bit sickly, or if there seems to be an infestation of some kind of bugs on something, you need to get at that just as quickly as possible. So if I could have the next slide, please. These are the 3 kinds of gardens that we will try to cover and touch on as we go through our presentation together, Deb and I. And the first one is actually some of my containers, which right now, of course, are in the house. We don't put them out till the frost danger is gone. And I have big pots as well as littler ones. The middle one is raised beds, a very popular way of growing plants and vegetables. We'll be talking something about those. And then, of course, on the third, you've got a kind of bird's eye view of a fragment of an in-ground garden. And you may choose to do just one of these, or you may have all 3 of these kinds of gardens. And so we are going to try and spread that around so that everybody who's participating today gets a little bit of a feel for their particular kind of choice of garden. So in order to go from the theoretical to practical, we have a poll in which we ask you, the participants, to share more or less what area of the country, where are you living? Are you in the Shenandoah Valley or nearby or further away? And also, what kind of a garden are you planning for this year, 2022? Thank you. Over to you, Sonia, for the first poll. And you do need to slide down. There's more than two questions.
Actually, that poll is going to be coming from Deb since she has the controls.
Should be up.
Oh, sorry, Deb, I beg your pardon.
That's okay. It should be up. There are 3 questions people are answering.
And Deb will give you some feedback on everybody's collective answers when everybody's finished.
It says we got 58, 62% participating.
Oh, you're really able to, that's terrific. I didn't know.
And I
Well,
think
it's only
we are expecting, Paula, that unlike a lot of our normal webinars, that most of the participants are local, because a lot of them signed up when we were hoping to do it in person at Blandy. We normally are trying to cater to Australians and Europeans and people kind of from all over the world, and certainly all over the country as well. But we're thinking probably, we'll find out soon, that most of you are gardening in the Valley or the Piedmont like we are.
5% are in the Piedmont so far, and 85% are in the Shenandoah Valley, and 10% are elsewhere, but we've only got 83% have participated so far.
I hope
So-
nobody's having technical problems.
Well, we'll give them another, what do you think, Deb, minute or less to participate, and you've got to answer all the questions in order for it to record your answers. I think there's 3 questions, and then Deb will share the
down to the 3rd question.
Deb will share the results. But yeah, it's always fun to kind of know where your fellow gardeners are coming from, and also feel free to put in the chat, where you're coming from, what your interests are, how you found us, anything you want us to know.
We try and make it as close to an in-person interaction as we possibly can technically, because knowing your participants makes all the difference to what we actually cover. In fact, I mean, we know what we're going to cover, but we can tilt one way or the other if we find particular interest from the participants.
Okay, we seem to be stuck at 84%, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now
Thank
and
you.
then share the results.
Excellent. Thank you, Deb.
So 86% are in Shenandoah Valley, 5% are Piedmont, 10% are elsewhere. We have a few folks that are brand new, 19%. I've tried it, I'm stuck, and I could use some help. I think that's everybody. No.
That's me.
33%. Done this for a bit, but I could always benefit from, I'm assuming that's from more experience. Yes, others' experience. And then I'm an expert, and I'm not sure why I'm here.
I love the line. It's wonderful.
So we have some experts. Well, they can just take over and teach with you guys, right?
Yes.
And then we have a mixture of containers, raised beds, and in the ground. And
Can you roll it down? Can you roll it down so we can see the results?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, it's containers raised. 52% of containers, 81% do raised garden beds, 48 are in the ground, and 5% is not sure yet.
Okay.
So seems that raised garden beds are the primary place. I personally have all 3. So all right, so I'm gonna stop sharing that poll. And
Well, thank you, Deb, so much. And I will formally introduce you. I just wanted to add that she is our esteemed colleague and friend, and we know what a good gardener she is, and lots of other things too. She raises poultry, I know, and I'm so pleased to be sharing this presentation with her. Over to you, Deb, and thank you so much.
all right, thank you, Paul. I appreciate the introduction. As Sarah had mentioned earlier, I've been a lifelong gardener, and I grew up in, believe it or not, a very urban environment inside the Beltway, right near Tyson's Corner, if you're familiar with the area. in Fairfax County. And my mother had a garden in our little urban lot. Matter of fact, the joke about her garden is the fact that I'd come home from school and cut the heads off the broccoli and cook them for my snack, and my dad never got any. He couldn't figure out why. But anyway, so that's kind of in my DNA to garden, and I have done it everywhere, including on a ground floor flat with a postage stamp size area outside. I put herbs in it, but that was fine. That's all I needed right then. So everybody looks like they're gardening in some, or mostly everybody looks like they're gardening in some manner or not. And I currently live in Berryville, and I have
One sec.
a very large garden. It's about 40 by 40, but it's expanding, and we'll talk some more about that. But right now, when we're talking about the success of gardening, the things that you need to consider are what the plants need. They need the sun, they need the water, and they need the terrain. And while we're looking at this little garden example right here, I'd like to point out a couple things that we're going to be talking about later. One of the things is, if you look off to the top kind of right-hand side, you'll see there's a good size hill there. And that hill is going to be something I'm going to be mentioning later on, but there's also shadows on that hill, and there's trees in the background. Those are kind of things around a garden that can be a factor that you need to consider. The other thing I want to point out is that there's some tall flowers in the background and over on the right-hand side, and it looks like there's a little bit of shade in the lower right-hand corner. All of those things can be used to your benefit, but they can also become issues if you're not aware of where those things happen. But we'll get into those a little bit further on as we talk about those. Can I get the next slide, please, Sonia? All right, so this is when sun is important. The vegetables that produce a fruit need full sun. They need the sun because this is how they get their food. They turn that beautiful water and air and sunlight into the plant food. Most plants need at least 6 hours per day. Some need more, some need less. And that's where it's important to know what you're planting and where that sun is. So you could check your sunlight hours. And I even suggest doing a sun map. Take a little piece of paper, go out and sketch where your sunlight falls or where your shade is, and do that 2 or 3 times, 4 times, 5 times in a day, as often as you can get out there, to try to get a feel for what your sunlight is. On that first picture we saw, there was a shade on the hill. It looked like it was kind of square. Maybe that was a building. The trees in the background, they look like they had a shadow underneath them. There's a little bit of shadow in the bottom right-hand corner. All of those things can factor in. If the trees are on your southern side or your western side, it's really going to inhibit your garden. So for me, I have a tree right next to the corner of my garden, which shades one corner of my garden. And so I put tender plants there, like the lettuces and so on, because they can put up with a little bit of shade. The good thing if you're using containers is you can move them where the sun is. You cannot move the sun where it doesn't want to go. But containers move. In an in-ground, you have a little bit of leeway. If you discover later that it didn't work where it was, it is possible to move an in-ground raised bed. Kind of a lot of work. Paula can tell you a little bit about that. But anyway, the majority of the vegetables that we want to grow need full sun, and we're talking tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, peas, corn. Those are solid sunlight. So knowing where your sun is important. Next slide, please. So water, quality of water is another thing. And while preparing for these slides and listening to some of the talks that Paula has done previously, I even learned something new. This picture here is some rain barrels that Paula has. I have some that are very similar to this. The rain comes down through the gutter off of the roof and into the barrels. One barrel feeds into another as it fills up, and then there's taps on the bottom. Rainwater is the absolute best water for your garden. It is exactly what nature intended the plants to have, and they use it quite readily, very well. The other thing is well water is your second best. While this side says well water, I'd like to preface that with saying by saying raw well water. A lot of well water gets run through a softener, and you'll see that's at the bottom of the list. So if you can get your water before it goes through the softeners or anything that you may have, that's the best option. City water is treated with chemicals typically in order to make it safe, unless you're in Flint, Michigan. But the city water definitely has chlorine. And so if you can take your tap water and let it sit out for a little while to help the chemicals evaporate, that's the best. Rainwater and well water are neutral. They don't add to your pH. They don't change. They don't have chemicals in them. And that's why that's really the best for your plants. But if you have a water softener like I do, it introduces sodium to the water, which confuses the plants. I was reading up on this. The plants think that they've taken up more water than they should have. And so they just don't take up the water anymore, and it causes them to actually start to dehydrate, which prohibits their growth. And there isn't any way to change that. You can't add any chemicals to the softened water to take out that sodium level, and the sodium stays in the ground. So your groundwater, your softened water can create a problem in your soil, which is one of the first things I'm going to tell you is to get your soil tested. Unless you're container gardening, you should have your soil tested. And the soil test, one of the things that you can test for is salt. Now, Sonia's going to pop in the chat a link to the Virginia Tech soil testing. It is between $10 to $16, depending on the options that you choose. And it's something that Paula and I totally believe in, is testing. And since I've been watering now my garden with softened house water for the last 3 or 4 years, I'm going to have to get my soil tested again just to make sure I haven't over salted it, more or less. And that is one of the options on the Virginia Tech test. You can get, if you have softened water, you can get a bypass valve installed by your plumber, and that'll get you straight to the raw water. I only have one tap in the front of the house that has that capability, but something to think about. Either way, rainwater is your best bet. I suggest everybody have some kind of a container for catching rainwater, and then using that precious liquid on your plants. Next slide, please. So, hardiness zones. This shows the Shenandoah Valley and where we are within the Shenandoah Valley. I happen to be in Clarke County, but in a valley in Clarke County. So my elevation is very low. I'm not up in the mountains, but that can make a big difference in how your weather is, as can trees and buildings and everything else. If you recall that picture that we looked at with the example garden, that hill over there on the back right-hand side, that could be my yard. It isn't, but it could be, because I have a very steep hill like that. It runs down to my garden. So I have to worry about water runoff. And I I tried gardening in the front yard where it was nice and high and out in the full sun, and I have a complete rock shelf there. So there's no gardening happening in the front of my yard. So now my garden is in the backyard. It's kind of a flat place, but it isn't perfect. And the water has obviously run down during the house being built and other people living here, because what's considered the western and most southern corner of my garden is all clay, but the northeast side is sandy in a 40 by 40 garden. Go figure. But it makes working with my garden a little different. I have to actually put a little ditch in called a swale with a ridge over it to keep the water from washing down into that far corner. I also garden with hay bales. The hay bales help mitigate some of that water runoff, slow it down and redirect it. And quite successful with the hay bale gardening. I layer a little bit of topsoil on top of the hay bale, and then do radishes and lettuces on that. But in our zone, you could be in the mountains, or you could be in a valley, you could be in the city, you could be in the country, and all of those make a difference. So if you know your first and last frost date, try to pay attention to that when it comes to planting your garden, but also realize that your particular spot might be slightly different. Like some say our zone is May 1st is our last frost date, but most of us, I don't think, plan before Mother's Day. But knowing a little bit about your area and where you are can really make a difference in your successful gardening. Can I get the next slide, please? Sonia? Oh, there we go. All right. So this is a slide that shows the types of soil we have. If you'll notice that very, very top layer where the grass is and the roots, in that dark area, that's your topsoil. It's a very, very, very small portion underneath. And I'm sure everybody in Clarke County is very, very familiar how far you can go and then you're hitting rock. We have a lot of rock. Matter of fact, my yard has whole areas that look like an alligator back coming up through the ground. But that topsoil layer is sometimes just 2 or 3 inches. And that's what you're trying to help grow. You're trying to grow your own soil, grow it to where it's nice and thick and healthy and can sustain life. Because this is the living, breathing part of the earth, is that topsoil layer. That's where there's little microbes doing all kinds of work, of course, earthworms and so on. But the roots are talking to each other. They are absorbing minerals. There's a lot going on in that 2 to 3 inches. And that's the part that we want to keep healthy. We have some ideas of how to do that, but that's really where all life happens. There's organic matter in there at the very, very top, where the plants have died down and fallen over and are being absorbed into the soil. And that's where your compost comes in. It's an organic layer, and you can always put on more compost. There's no such thing as too much, and it's one of the best amendments that you can do. But I can talk about that forever. Let's go on to the next slide. My favorite subject. No. Why get your soil tested? As I mentioned earlier, the Virginia Tech test will show you whether you have salt in your soil. I suggest you do a test every couple years. Some people say test every year, but it's important to know what you've got to start with, and then you'll know what you need to do with it. A good soil is a combination of a lot of different things. organic matter, which is your compost and decaying materials, your mineral content. You need to know what your pH is, because some plants require a higher pH than other plants. And then the loftiness of the soil makes a difference, because it either holds water or it allows water to pass through, or it can be clayish or it can be sandy. And a combination is necessary for there to be enough water and air at the root level. And that's what helps it to grow. When you get your soil test, it'll often tell you what you need to amend with. And as I said, compost is one of the things that you could always add. And we'll talk about that some more. But the thing that I liked about the Virginia Tech test is it also says, what are you growing? So you can say, I'm going to put blueberries in this area, and it'll tell you that you need to add more acidity to it because they're an acid loving plant. Or you can say, I'm growing vegetables. They're going to say, okay, your ground isn't fertile enough. You're going to have to add a fertilizer. Now, I personally use only organic. Sari mentioned that I have an organic farm. So I'm very cautious with the chemicals that I put on, that they're organic ones, but I also use them very judiciously because I am very close to the Opequon Creek, and I don't want any runoff from my garden to cause a problem for the creek. Can I get the next slide, please? So, amending your soil. And this is where I get really excited because I love compost. Matter of fact, Sustainability Matters does some classes on composting, and I can talk about that all day long. The compost that I use is a lazy man's compost. I have a couple bins in the back part of my field, and I just dump everything out there that was a living plant, whether it's citrus peels or onion peels or leaves that I've cut off my house plants, coffee grounds, eggshells, it all goes back there. And then I just leave it for a long time, sometimes a year or more. When one bin fills up, I move to the next one, to the next one, the next one. When one is done, then I'll go back and pull it out. But there's faster ways to compost, and we'll talk about this. In this particular picture that Paula has provided for us, that's her husband, Tom, and he's apparently shoveling a little bit of manure out of that bucket there and putting it on the plants. If you can get aged manure, that is an excellent amendment for your soil. Emphasize the word aged because it needs to sit and settle out and decompose a bit before you can use it. Mature manure will have no smell. If you get a load of manure and it smells icky, it's not aged, and you need to let it sit there until it is has settled out. But adding things like leaves are good. Paula told me that her husband Tom uses like a weed whacker inside of a metal trash can to chop up the leaves because they have like oak leaves and they don't decompose very well, which I thought was an excellent idea. But we happen to have leaves that decompose very readily, and also a lot of pine. So I have to be careful how I use those leaves and pine needles because they do raise the acidity of the soil. So again, knowing what you're adding and putting that in your garden is kind of an important thing. So then when you have your soil tested, you know what other amendments to add. The other thing that we have around here is wood ash, because we have a wood burning fireplace in the house. Wood ash will neutralize acidity, but you have to use it very judiciously, just a little bit at a time, because it can make a big difference. The acidity of your soil should be in the 6.5 range for regular normal gardening. It's a near neutral level for normal gardening. And again, if you're going to use organic fertilizer, you want to be careful if you use any fertilizer, that you don't have any water runoff issues or that you're using too much, because it can burn your plants. One of the things that I'll also tell you, which is a really good thing, is wood chips. Wood chips can line your paths. They help with keeping the soil moist. They keep the weeds down. And there is a website called Chip Drop. And if you have arborists in your area, they may have to get rid of some wood chips, and driving all the way back to like the landfill may be too much trouble for them. And if you're nearby and you're willing, they'll drop it at your house. I've participated in that with some local arborists and have ended up with quite a bit of wood chips, and I'm able to use that on the pathways in my garden. And the wood chips take a long time to decompose, so they act as a weed barrier, and then eventually as they decompose, they're a compost-like amendment for your garden, which is a win-win as far as I'm concerned. Next slide, please, Sonia. So because we're talking about 3 different types of gardening, there are 3 major categories of soil to use. A germination or seed starting mix, you want to use that if you're starting little tiny seeds. Important thing to know is that it does not have fertilizer in it, and you don't want fertilizer on the itty bitty little seeds. You want to wait till they've got at least 2 leaves to them, and then a very, very dilute solution of fertilizer to help them grow. Then once they're the size that you want to transplant them, then you can put them into regular soil, either in the ground or in a container, in a raised bed. And then that soil will have more fertilizer to it, hopefully. Potting soil is typically a soilless mixture, and you can be used for seeds, but it is best for containers. It's loftier, and it allows the plants that you put in them to grow, and so they're not too compacted. You want to be able to get the water in there, and you want it to be able to percolate through so that they're not overwatered and that they have enough aeration. And then topsoil can be either applied on the ground or in raised beds. If you have a lot of clay and you want to get some topsoil delivered to you or bought in bags, you can use that as kind of a beginning amendment in your in-ground gardening. I did make the mistake on my first raised bed of using a non-soil mix that was advertised as being better for your garden, but I found it was too lofty, and it allowed the water to straight run out the back bottom of the raised bed. And I had a lot of problems with that bed until I got some good topsoil mixed in there to actually hold the water. But that was just a little mistake that I got to make. We jokingly refer to it as we make all the mistakes and tell you about them so that you don't make them yourself. So I'm not afraid of owning up to those kinds of mistakes. But the in-ground gardening is what I do mostly. And so amendments and constantly adding to my soil has been a big help for making the soil healthier. And as I said, the compost is a big part of that. Next slide, please. I think I'm talking too fast.
Deb, did you want to stop for any questions?
Yeah,
Or-
I was going to. Like I said, I think I'm talking too fast, and it's just part of being nervous. So if we have a couple questions, Sonia, Sari.
We had a couple about pH levels, which I think you kind of covered in terms of how you can amend the soil to, raise or lower acidity and deal with pH.
Yeah, the wood ash is a good natural alternative to reduce the acidity. Sulfur can be added to increase the acidity. But getting your soil tested is like the first step, because you don't know what you need until you know what you have. Once you know what you have, then you know what you need, because you know where you're going to put your plants. But those are the two easiest ones for soil pH. Again, though, if you have been watering with softened water like I have, it can change the pH too. So like I said, I'm having my soil tested now because I just learned something in the last month. Anything else?
We just got in a question about rain barrel programs, either at Blandy or with Sustainability Matters. And I assume that is how to build your own or how to acquire one.
Sarah, you're going to have to answer that one.
We have worked on some rain barrel programs in the past. Normally, realistically, what we found is that the costs of the raw materials to actually make your own rain barrel tends to add up to almost the cost of purchasing one. And so it's not necessarily worth putting together a giant workshop around that unless you have access to free materials. But I believe that the Frederick County, Paula, you might be able to speak to this because you have used it. Frederick County Department of Solid Waste, Gloria Puffenberger, definitely has a program where they provide subsidized composters. Do they have rain barrels too, Paula?
Right now, no, I don't think so. However, it's always, if you're living in Frederick County, you certainly could make an inquiry about that. I would say that different counties in this region and beyond our region, I know that at one time we went to Rappahannock County and purchased, or they had a workshop where you actually built it. They gave you paid for it, but it was very reasonable. And they paid for the fittings for the tap at the bottom and the screened thing at the top and so on. And then you put the thing together in a workshop. There were a lot of those maybe 10 years ago.
Right.
Every now and again, a county will announce that they are having one. And they are actually, they still would save you some money. And the one thing I would say is don't get too small a rain barrel. I've had colleagues and friends who got little titchy ones, and it runs out too quickly. You really need quite a big barrel. I have 4 of them, and that's sometimes not enough. But keep an eye out, because there are reasonable ways of reasonable workshops which are worth it if you can do it. But otherwise, you may want to purchase a couple. And again, install it high up, because you want to be able to use gravity on the hole to draw the water down. If you put it at ground level, it's hard to get a bucket or a watering can under it.
So my husband and I put together our rain barrels. Some of them I bought at auction, but our rain barrels are just 55-gallon garbage cans with a tap on the bottom that I can hook a hose to. I do have also one of these large industrial white containers. I think it holds 250 gallons. I have 2 of those. And those I purchased from an importer of olive oil and balsamic vinegar. So they're food grade. And I use them to basically aggregate what comes off of the other smaller rain barrels. And
that's a very good point about food grades. If you're going to use pickle barrels or something like that, be sure it's food grade.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what we've done. And they have a tap in them already and a huge opening. And we just aggregate from the trash cans to that.
And sometimes those are available. So I know that, gosh, maybe a couple of years ago now, a local food producer in our area was getting rid of a huge number of fairly clean food grade barrels. And so that was something that we posted on our Facebook page and in our Facebook groups. So, when we hear about things like that, we do spread the word if people want to get those materials for free. So definitely keep track of on Facebook and follow those. Keep an eye out for that. Share information yourself in the groups if you hear about that. I think that what Josephine was also asking, though, was a program on the mechanics of rain capture, which we are not doing at the moment, but can certainly put on the list for something to consider in the future. So thanks for that.
All right, do we have any
We have another one in the
There's a
chat.
good question here about larvae of the mosquitoes.
Oh,
The little mosquito pucks.
so
I cut them up. You don't need a whole mosquito puck. They're fairly expensive. They are extremely effective. And I very much recommend it. You do not want to breed mosquitoes in your rain barrels.
So what Biff and I do is we have basically a landscaping type cloth that it's very permeable, and we put that over top of our garbage can rain barrels and then put the lid on, and there's just a small opening for the water to come in from the downspout. But the mosquitoes can't get into the actual water itself because of this permeable fabric layer. And that's one thing that we have done. We have like the pucks like you talking about, but it's actually a little container of granules, and you can just put in a couple teaspoons into a 55-gallon container and it will kill them. So if like when the wind whips the lid off or something bizarre happens and the mesh isn't there to stop the mosquitoes from getting in, I can just put a couple of these little tiny granules in and it'll kill the mosquitoes. Also very, very effective, and it does not affect the water quality. It is actually even safe for my chickens to be drinking the water with these granules. I wish I would have thought to bring it to show you, but that was not my plan. Any other questions?
And if somebody wants to unmute to ask a question, feel free. Well, at this point in time.
I have a question. This is William Spenrad.
Hey,
I
William.
I have a property. It's an acre property. And unfortunately, I have about 7 very large black walnut trees on this property. And my question is, I know I've read that it affects the soil, but if I had raised beds, is there something in the air that also precludes good growing?
Not from walnuts. Yeah. But the one thing I guess you would want to think about, I have a huge number of walnuts as well, so I have some of these issues too, is that really the juglone, the chemical that the walnuts exude that poisons tomatoes and really almost anything other than most native plants, it does extend the full length of the drip line of the tree. And traditionally, what we were told was the drip line was about as far as the branches extend. It is now understood to be about 3 times as far as the branches extend, which if you have 1 acre and a lot of big walnuts might be your whole property. So just, beware that if you're planting something pretty deep rooted and the walnuts are reasonably close, even if they're in a raised bed, Paula and Deb, wouldn't you say that there is a possibility that the roots of, say, a tomato or something could get somewhat close to the walnut?
Yeah, I think it would depend on how deep his raised bed is.
Well, I was doing container plants. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was growing in pots, and even doing that, I see it just seems that they're not reaching their full potential.
Yeah.
Pots are difficult. That would obviously not be a walnut problem unless you were scooping up soil that was near the walnut and filling your pot with that. But I am personally terrible at container gardening. Paula and Deb, on the other hand, manage all sorts of things in containers. It's hard.
By the way, the juglone will not effuse through the air. You know,
Right.
you don't have to worry about that. It's really in the soil,
that's
right,
what
Sari?
Right, right. Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. It's not a problem at all with the air. So his container problems should not be juglone related at all. Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether if you have a deep enough, you know, maybe a foot of raised bed, quite a deep one. And here I'm really not knowledgeable, but you would be sorry. If you lined the bottom of the raised bed with at least permeable landscaping cloth so that most of nothing would diffuse upwards, but still it could drain enough, would that help with the juglone problem, even if there was a tree fairly nearby or several trees?
But Paula, you're talking about a 1 foot raised bed. I mean, would that be deep enough I mean, that would be fine for something like lettuce or whatever, but it would.
Yeah, it wouldn't be for tomatoes, no.
Right. You wouldn't be able to grow the deeper rooted plants in that because they would get stymied by the landscape fabric. And one of the interesting things about juglone, because when I first bought this property, I was doing a lot of research on it, is that there are all of these lists of juglone tolerant and juglone intolerant plants. And you will sometimes find the same plants on both the tolerant and the intolerant list, which means that, you know, different people have had different experiences with them. And something that I have heard from a lot of, you know, our friends who are conservation professionals, foresters, and extension agents, is that it really is a bit erratic. And just like some people are more aggressive than others, some walnut trees are more aggressive than others and produce more juglone. And so you kind of have to experiment with your particular property and see what's going to work. Yeah.
All right, so if there aren't any more questions, I'll get started on our next slide.
I'd just like to point out that we have a nice post from Stephanie saying that there is going to be a workshop on the rain barrels March 1st at Shenandoah County Parks and Rec. None of us probably know very much about that, but that's certainly worth investigating.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
There's also all kinds of YouTube videos about it. Virtually anything that you want to do where gardening is concerned is on a YouTube video. The only thing you have to be aware of is that people in different areas will tell you things that you could do in your soil that you really can't. All right, so on setting your gardening priorities, we have quite a different group of people doing different kinds of things, but it depends on, you know, what you're planting and where you plan on planting it. So if you're going to grow tomatoes, for instance, your in-ground tomatoes would be about 3 feet apart, allowing for full expansion of both the roots and the upper plant. I trellis mine because they like to grow and grow and grow. Cherry tomatoes are one of our favorites here, and they did absolutely excellent this year in that environment. If you're going to do them in a raised bed, you want to get one that's a little bit more compact, but you can put them 1 to 1.5 feet apart. And if they're in a pot, you only want 1 plant for a 16-inch pot. I actually have a large pot, probably closer to a 15-gallon pot that had a cherry tomato in it this last year on my patio next to a railing, and it went over the railing on both sides in the corner and did spectacularly, but it took over the whole pot. And it did quite well that way, but it's something to make note. Because spacing your plant is really, really important, as is figuring out your garden size. I started out with a 20 by 20, and I'm now at a 40 by 40 size garden with a hoop house and 2 expansion areas for vines and bushes. just because my garden keeps growing as I add in new things each year. Now, I will say, don't try to do everything your first year in a garden, even your second year. Get to know your garden, and then you can expand as you and your family need. So one of the things that you can consider is, what kind of vegetables do you want to grow? And that helps you figure out how you're going to fit them all in your little, it's like a little jigsaw puzzle. Put some here, put some there, depending on what grows best together, what grows best in the sun, what grows best in the shade. That's where your sun map is going to help you out. Knowing what your soil is and what amendments you're putting in, that'll help you too, because if you have acidic soil or whatever, that'll help guide your planting efforts. My mother reminds me quite often that in her class on horticulture, they had to do basically a landscaped yard thing, and her professor really pushed the fact that it's the mature size of the plant. You have to plant on the mature size of your tree, your bush, your whatever, not how cute it looks in that little pot that you bought from the store. That's not the size that you're going to be looking at or trying to figure out. So those are all considerations that you need to have when you're setting your garden priorities. And I will say, on possible growing vegetables, looking at your family likes, also look at things you want to experiment with. My mother, for instance, loves parsnips. I didn't know that until I grew parsnips. And she goes, "Oh, I love parsnips." Who knew? But sometimes it just takes a little bit of experimentation. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about planning your garden. So this is sketching your garden. It's part of your overall plan. And I have to tell you, I use grid paper. I thought I had saved a piece of grid paper to show you. But my plan for my garden in the spring never turns out what it looks like in the fall. Never. It never does. But with this example we have here, it also specifies which direction you're facing. Where is your north? Where is your south? It's really important to know that, because it'll make a difference how the sun goes across over the season. And you want to make sure that you have put your plants in the optimal location. A friend of mine told me once that plants are not furniture. You can't put them where you think they'll look good. You have to put them where they thrive, this area that they want. And I've made that mistake, because I've put plants where I thought they would look good and they died. It happens to the best of us. So with this graph paper, you can map out exactly how much per square you can put in and how you're going to place it so that you have the best plants together. I did not realize that beans and garlic hate each other. And last year, my beans did not do well on the side of the trellis where my garlic had been growing. They did very, very well on the other side of the trellis, far away from the garlic. But they still grew. They still had some beans, but just not as much. So putting in optimal plants in the best location, thinking about the mature level of the plants, and keeping your tall plants on your north side so that they don't hinder the growth of your other vegetables. I put my tomatoes on trellises on the north side. And like I said, they just did fabulous this last year. And I definitely love my trellises. Next slide. So I have probably gone way too fast, Paula.
Okay, you're doing wonderfully.
Anyway, so this is another thing that I think people fail to consider, and this is reading your seed packets. This is amazing information, and it's all specific to the seed that's in the packet. And one of the things that's really important is that it helps you with spacing. It helps you plot out your garden. It helps you with succession planning. Because if you'll notice this bok choy, it says it's a cool season vegetable that grows in 30 to 35 days. Well, if you plant that at the beginning of March, you'll know that you'll be able to plant your peas or something else in its place very quickly. By April or May, you're going to be able to plant peas, for instance, or beans or something else that can tolerate the cold in the early months. So this is an excellent way for you to know what pH it requires, how tall it gets, how fast they grow, when they're going to reach maturity, when you get to harvest. And it's just a lot of information. I also use this when I am putting tags on my plants. I will say what kind of a plant it is, but also the variety. So it can be bok choy, but it may be a purple bok choy, or it may be, something else. But that way you'll know what variety it is, and you'll know whether to get that next year or not. I also use this information for if it needs to be trellised. One of the things that I dearly, dearly love is yellow wax beans. I did not know that almost every yellow wax bean that you can buy in the store is just a bush bean. It is not a trellising bean. And I've tried several different varieties, and the seed packet doesn't specify sometimes. Generally, that means it's a bush. If it doesn't say, that it's a pole bean, you have to assume that it's a bush. But again, this is experimenting. The other thing is that every single garden is an experiment. Every single pot you pot up is an experiment. And as you learn to know your plants better, then you can plan, but Mother Nature often throws in curveballs. Last year, we had a late season frost in April. A lot of people were scrambling to try to cover their plants because we don't normally have a frost in April. Then there's wonderful summers where we're dry as can be, and other summers where it's so wet you can't do anything. Some dear friends of mine in Bluemont have a huge commercial gardening process, and in their first years, the first year that they were gardening out in Bluemont, they had dryness. Everything was dry. Then the next year they were planting pumpkins, and they were so rained out that they actually ended up having to purchase pumpkins for their pumpkin picking contest. They had to go up to Pennsylvania, buy pumpkins, and bring them in because their field was so wet that everything rotted in the field. And so even commercial growers will have problems because Mother Nature likes to do that to us. And all you can do is next year.
Yeah.
Next plant, next season. Spring failures don't mean you're going to fail all the time. Sometimes something will frost, but then you can plant it in August and harvest in October. And that sometimes is a good way to do your succession planning from both spring and fall. So any more questions for me before I turn it over to Paula in the next poll?
We did have one in the chat that I answered, but I'm sure that they would appreciate hearing more of your insights on it. How important is crop rotation in healthy soil? Do you still need to do it? My instinct was it's still probably a good idea because the insects they'll find your plants eventually anyway. But
well, the key there is healthy soil. A lot of in-ground soil develops a fungus, and you can't, especially it comes up as a blight or whatever, or powdery mildew. It's in the soil. So crop rotation helps with that, as does having a good fungicide program. I use a lot of neem oil for that kind of a thing. I've also heard that using golden seal root is a good fungicide. I haven't grown enough golden seal yet that I feel confident in harvesting and making my own, but that's one of my plans. But anyway, it's crop rotation is a good idea, as is your watering. If you're watering top down, it's going to splash up any fungicides or whatever, or any funguses or blights that are in the soil. If you can use a drip line or soaker hoses or water at the base by hand, you're going to be better off from and not spreading diseases. And as Paula indicated, prowling your garden to pull off any leaves as soon as they show any sign of sicknesses, pulling out whole plants if necessary. But I definitely believe in crop rotation and companion planting. But that's because I don't want to have to spray unless I absolutely have to. Paula, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'll be dealing with quite a bit about that in the
Awesome.
next section. Right. Well, let me, however, well, hello everybody again, and thank you so much for your response on the polls. It's very interesting to see how widely spread you are. Most of you cover almost all the plants, so that's wonderful, really wonderful. And we hope we're really going to be able to help you to have very good crops, good productivity this year and all the years following. I would like to start with seeds, however, because this will take a little bit of time, and I want to talk about why we might start some of our plants from seed rather than going out and purchasing the little plants. And there are advantages to that, of course. There are two ways of starting seeds. Most of them we start right outside in the garden, in our containers, in our raised beds. But some of them, because we want a head start and get a good early-ish crop, we start them indoors. And that is a little bit more work, but it's also leads to some very satisfying results very often. And there are some advantages. Probably the main advantage of considering starting your own seeds rather than purchasing plants in a nursery or a big box store is that you can choose from a vast array of varieties that the seed catalogs or the nurseries will put out for you to select. And as you, for example, tomatoes is a very good example because there are probably more commercially available seeds for varieties of tomatoes than almost anything else. And while buying small plants is very nice because they give you a good start, you don't get the range of varieties. And if you do grow tomatoes year after year, you begin to get rather fussy, and that there are certain varieties you really like very much and you want to experiment. And for example, for myself, I might grow 6 different varieties of tomatoes each year, but I'll always put one new variety to taste test to see how it grows and so on, an experiment that's sort of ongoing. So what are the problems with starting inside? Well, inside is not as good an environment in terms of the sun and even perhaps the soil moisture as outside. You have to fuss a little bit about those planting the seeds inside, but we'll walk through it a bit. Of course, all your vegetables can be started directly outside. You don't have to start anything indoors. It's mostly because you want to get a head start and get ahead of the frost date, which limits you for some plants what you can grow outside. I mean, you can, and it's to do with the temperature of the soil, and we'll get to that in a moment. So I'm going to sort of walk you through what you're going to do with your seeds. There is a little bit of difference between having small seeds or some of the larger seeds. Some of your companion plants like nasturtiums like peas, for example, are rather larger seeds, and you have a slightly different approach to them that you would to the small seeds, and they're probably the majority of them. The first thing, of course, to do is to decide how are you going to plant, if you're going to plant indoors, what kind of vehicle, what kind of vessel are you going to use? I used to always use these little seed tray things, which would be filled with the soil or the soilless mix, and then I'd plant the seeds fairly thinly along the top. And these would go row after row after row into containers, maybe like this, and they would be filled up. And each little container like this would have a single, would have parsley, or it would have tomato seeds, or it would have eggplants, or whatever it would have. Lately, I have been more inclined to go for cells, and I have some examples. These are rather special cells, which are fairly deep, so that you actually can grow on your seedlings to be fairly good size, because there's root length possible here. But I've also indulged myself this year in buying some very fancy cell packs like this. And supposedly the silicone bottoms make you able to poke out the little plant when it's ready to be poked out very easily, because it's very flexible. It's a silicone thing at the bottom. The thing I really like the best about this is that when you're finished at the end of the season, you've rinsed them off, you can put them on the top of the dishwasher and do the final clean and sanitizing of your material. So you're going to fill your cells with moist germination mix. You heard from about germination mix from Deb. I will just say it's only a fine form of potting soil. It's very good for small seeds. So tomato seeds, you really, it's a little nicer for them to go into germination mix or seed starting mix. So you're going to fill your cells with the germination mix. You're going to maybe shake it on the bench top, or you're going to gently pat it down. You're going to make a little indentation with your finger or a pencil, and into each of these cells, you're going to pop 1 or 2 seeds. 1 or 2 if they're fresh seeds. If they're a little older, and sometimes we do have access to slightly older seeds, but they're still going to germinate, just not as prolifically as brand new seeds. And then you might want to put 3 seeds or even 4. But don't try and cram in a bunch of seeds, because you're only going to have to thin them out later. And are you ruthless enough to thin them very vigorously? Then you're going to want to put your filled cells with the seeds, and the seeds will be covered with a layer of your germination mix very thinly, and patted down, and they should be nice and wet, moist, not wet. But then you're going to put it in the tray. And this is a Paula thing. I don't know that anybody else does this, but this is what I do. I cut up old bits of toweling, or in this case, it's an old washcloth that I no longer have use for. And I pad that because it holds a little moisture a little bit longer than if I just put this in the bare. If I took this out and just put it in here, I'd have to water it gingerly a little bit more than I have to when I have a moist washcloth pad down at the bottom. And then here are your seeds going to start to grow. Most seeds do well do germinate best in the dark. There are a few exceptions, which you can usually find out on the seed packet or dear old Google. Google is very useful. The one that you might want to watch for is lettuce seeds. Lettuce seeds do better in the light to germinate rather than in the dark. I never knew that, but I do find that is true. It's not that they don't germinate in the dark, but you get a better crop if you let them be in the light. I will darken my seed tray here, but the main thing about these seeds germinating is, as Deb began to tell you, they really need the moisture and of course the air and they need moisture. They do not need fertilizer. People make a mistake and think you've got to fertilize the seeds. Those wonderful little seeds are little pods of nutrients, just right for the tiny seedling that's going to pop out of the seed. Wonderful. It's just absolutely amazing. But you want to keep the moisture in. So you put on, in this case, I've put on the upside down, this plastic. This is from something else, actually. This did not come with covers, but you can use any kind of water resistant cover. And then I put on a piece of black plastic bag, that, of course, I'm always recycling everything, and cover it so that it's nice and dark, so that your seed cells are dark. Now, if you, in fact, are growing lettuce, you might want to have a separate kind of a material vessel like this, and just do your lettuce separately and don't cover it with the black plastic. It doesn't matter if you do cover it, they'll still germinate, but just maybe not quite as well. So that's perhaps a little bit pernickety. Now, here are your tiny seedlings, and for our purposes, you can look at the lower picture on the slide, and this is actually outside, and these are beet seedlings, I'm pretty sure. And I wanted to point out that those two leaves that have first popped up, that's all there is to show you where the seedling is in this particular example. And those two leaves are not what we call true leaves. They are the cotyledons, the feed tree leaves that are actually still feeding the little growing plant. Where you don't call it really a seedling until it's got two pairs of true leaves. The next thing that will happen with these little tiny seedlings is that it will grow first one pair of leaves and then a second pair of leaves. And then you've got a real seedling. Once you've got that seedling, it's saying, yes, I could do with a little fertilizer. And as Deb told you, do use very dilute fertilizer, but do start putting fertilizer in your water. In my case, I will use a soluble fertilizer and dilute it at least 4 times more than they say on the container. So it's really very dilute, but it's getting a constant source of fertilizer. So that's how your indoor plants are going to be starting. And now you've got your little plants with 2 sets of real leaves. You've got to give them a little bit of room, and that's when I find something or other that will go over and make like a mini greenhouse. Can you see that there's a little lid? You've got room for about 2 or 3 inches of growth, and then you're going to have to do something about them. If it is after your last frost date, you cross your fingers and maybe you can start thinking about moving them outside, and we'll talk about that. If they're actually going to have to stay inside because it's still April, then you are going to have to transplant to bigger pots. Now then you might be able to go to pots that look like this, or what I usually do is using our Sustainability Matters guidelines, I will use recycled all kinds of containers. And the one main thing is don't forget to make a hole in the bottom. Let's see if I can get this so that you can see it. The hole does not have to be pretty. It merely has to let drainage happen out of the pot. And then this little pot is considerably bigger than these cells that I was just showing you, actually. But you might want to be going, for tomatoes, you might well want to be going to quite a lot bigger pots. Or you can buy, of course, nice looking pots and have them all very organized and pretty, but of course it's more expensive. So that's what you're going to do with your indoor plants. And I'm going to say only one thing about starting seeds outdoors. Again, look at what your seed packets say. There are some seed packets that say preferred method, and then they say outdoor planting. And for example, we wouldn't start corn, at least I wouldn't, inside. We wouldn't probably start peas inside, unless you just want the tender shoots and you don't worry about the peas, the fruit. It sort of depends. And as you've heard quite a bit from Deb, your experience will tell you what you want to do. Plus, you have friends at Sustainability Matters who will love to share gardening discussions and try to answer questions, or at least talk from their own experience. Now, you've got your seedlings, they're growing up, they're up at the top of this container. What are we going to do with them? We're going to start getting them ready to go outside. You can't just take your little seedlings and pop them out and put them in the soil, even if it is May the 15th. Why? Because it would be a shock to their little systems. So you have to do what we call hardening off. And hardening off is merely a process of gradually accustomizing them to the outside environment. And it's not just the temperature being cooler at night than your house, it's also wind. Inside the house, it's as still as can be. There is no wind, no breeze, no nothing. And those little seedlings, though they look sturdy enough, can be knocked over if there's a big wind all of a sudden. So you take them out, starting maybe an hour outside, put them in dappled shade. That's what I do, because the direct sun is too brilliant for these little fellas. They haven't been used to it inside the house. Even with a grow light, that's very much soft, less concentrated than the sun's beams. So treat them very gently as you take them outside. Get them adjusted to what it's going to be like to live in the real world. And Mother Nature will cooperate with you, of course. So you're going to harden them off by maybe the first day, taking them out for an hour or two. The next day you'll extend that to maybe 2 or 3 hours, and so on and so forth. And so you'll take at least a week, maybe 10 days, maybe even 2 weeks, to gradually accustom them to living outside. And then you're going to transplant them either into your container. If it's a tomato plant, for example, as Deb said, just one plant, one container, because that's going to take up all the root space that it will have in the container. Or you're going to put them in ground, and possibly you can consider using a cover at night if it's still pretty chilly, getting down near freezing, but hopefully not freezing. If it ever threatens freeze, you must cover those little tender seedlings with something or other. So be sure that you've got at least gallon milk jugs cut off that you can pop over them, what we used to call in England cloches. I don't know if they have them here, I've never seen them, but they were sort of like bell jars, glass bell jars. That's a little sideline. Anyway, so you've got your plants that you've grown indoors, and now outside, you're going to watch them. The other thing that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes are pests and diseases. And if you do use row covers and think about it carefully, that will also protect your seedlings, who are the most vulnerable to voracious insects and disease when they're young and tender and just delicious. Well, they're always delicious, but they're very tender when they're very small. So that's another good use for row covers. We'll be covering that in just a moment. Let me just say a word or two about if you're going to be planting your seeds outside. If they're fairly big seeds, you don't have to worry about the seed bed of your garden soil, but you might want to actually soak large seeds for a few hours in rainwater or clean water, just to soften the outside skin. It doesn't matter if you don't do it, it'll just take a little longer to germinate. But if you're anxious to speed things up, again, you could experiment, just soak some of them, mark them, and then leave the others the way. See if there is in fact any difference at all. I don't know, I've never done that experiment myself. But if you're going to be planting small seeds outside, you do want to make sure that the seed bed, that top surface in the bottom picture there, is pretty fine. There are a couple of rocks I can see on the left-hand side, actually, but most of the seed bed is pretty fine. And it's just giving the seeds the best chance to germinate well and grow their little seedlings very vigorously and nice. By the way, in case you're wondering, what on earth is that blue thing along the left-hand side of the picture? That happens to be my drip irrigation system. It looks a bit funny there, but it does give you a sense that that drip irrigation system, actually, the water that comes out from it expands to a sort of circle of 12 inches. So it reaches the roots of those little seedlings very nicely, actually. So that is actually quite a useful point to make. So that's starting the seeds. I should have mentioned earlier, which I rather forgot to do, and that is that labeling your seeds is extremely important. This cell thing is rather nice because they actually have like a matrix, A to Z and 1 to 10. So each is on a sort of plot, and they give you a graph that you can just put them in. But of course, the real thing is you want to have you want a little seed tags, because when they go out in the garden, they're going to have to be labeled separately anyway. So here again, sustainability matters. So I never, ever anymore buy seed labels or, garden labels. I cut up things like this into strips. I sit in front of the stupid television sometimes, and I'm cutting them into these nice little, on this side, they're nice and clean and plain, and they've got whatever kind of vessel, cottage cheese or whatever it was that I actually cut them from. But I don't spend money on labels, but I use an awful lot. And while I do wash them out sometimes I'm afraid I do discard them. But I try and use them more than 1 or 2 years. It depends on how sturdy the plastic is that I'm chopping up into labels. So I hope that's quite useful. So there we are, we've got our seeds. And now we're going to look, Deb, at the next slide for possible seeds. And some of the plant, of course, I didn't know what the participants were going to be growing. I'm rather relieved that you actually have got a lot of things listed there. So I just selected a few. And if you notice at the top of this slide, it says February, March. Yes, we can begin to think about planting the first seeds. However, the first thing you need to know if you're thinking about planting outdoors, and that's my first thing there, is what is the soil temperature? And I thoroughly recommend acquiring some kind of a thermometer that you can put into the soil and find out for sure. People have all kinds of theoretical systems of wetting their finger and putting it in the soil, and they can estimate. I can't do that, but I can use a thermometer, and if I can get it so that you can see it nicely, and turn it so you can everything's in it. Oh, unfortunately, the way the light is, you can't see that round thing has there it is, maybe a little bit. It is a dial, and it gives you the temperature relatively accurately. You stick the probe of the thermometer 3 to 5 inches into the soil. So you don't need a great long stick. This is actually for a compost pile. You don't need one like this. You need one that's at least, say, 4 or 5 inches long, with a head which you can read easily, and it's down in the ground. Poke it into the soil, probably in 2 or 3 different places, just to check that the soil temperature is the same everywhere, which it probably will be. And if it says 40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, I'm sorry, it's too early to plant any seeds at all. Why? Because that cold, wet soil will happily rot your seeds away, and you will not get germination. So it's very important to know. Now, as you go up in the temperature. For example, even peas would much prefer to be at 50 degrees or even 60 degrees. They will germinate faster. It's directly related, the temperature, to the speed of the germination. But as I say, if you want to get an early start and it gets up above 40, you could start planting your kale, lettuce, peas, spinach outside. Indoors, of course, you're not constrained about the temperature, but you are thinking about when you can put your mature little seedling plants outside. If you do it too early, they're going to get too big inside. And I've had that experience. I got enthusiastic one year and planted my tomato seeds, I think in February, late February. They were still so big and they were bumping up against the grow light and getting floppy. And I had to put little stakes in to kind of tie them up so they wouldn't flop over. Oh, it was a mess. So I don't actually start my seeds. And this might be something that we can discuss with Deb and Sonia and Sari and others about what they do. I don't plant my seeds until March, but I do like to get tomatoes, for example. And I was just hearing, I think from Jen, that peppers, they recommend it has a long time to grow slowly. So that is also another one that you might want to grow early. The other one I would like to mention, because we're going to be talking about pests in a minute, I have an awful battle with eggplants, which I love, and their pests, which seem to be virulent in this part, or at least in my vegetable garden. Flea beetles. They're quite innocuous to look at because you can hardly see them. They're so tiny, but they perforate the seeds, the leaves, so that it's like a little colander, and the poor leaf soon flops over. Before you know it, the whole plant is dead because there's just not enough photosynthesis going on to feed the plant. The bigger the plant, the less dangerous it is. These flea beetles can't overwhelm the plant, and so it's really good. This is another reason to use the row covers, because then you can keep and you really have to make sure that it's tight to the soil so that the flea beetles can't jump in. Amazing little insects, I'm afraid. But so that's another possible reason for using row covers and planting them early. So possibly tomatoes, eggplant, peppers could go in quite early if you're planting them inside. So this is just a possible seed list. Again, look at your seed packets and see what is recommended. So I've gone quite a bit into seeds because I think a lot of you will be planting seeds, and there are ways of making sure that you have a great deal of success. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Assessing your garden. Some of this we've already talked about, but this is an introduction to talking about weeds, insects, and plant disease. Again, prowling the garden is going to help you notice, observe, watch, be ready to analyze what's going on in some of your plants, and being able to act while the problem is small and containable and able to do something about it. When you prowl the garden, I have a few silly tips probably. Here again, I've got a thermometer to check your soil temperature. The example I've got here is a short probe so that you don't have to have the great long thing that I had. I like to carry a multi-tool. I don't have an orange handled one. I have a green handled one, which I couldn't lay my hands on just to show you. But it's really quite useful. Or the other thing that if you don't have one of those, I picked up a couple of these little snips for $1. I think it was at Dollar General. And they're amazingly useful, particularly in the early garden. You can snip off the a diseased leaf, or you can even snip off the whole plant if you have to. So that's also a good thing to have in your pocket. And I've mentioned carry a camera. Well, these days we just have our cell phone with us, and you can quick snap a photograph. If there's something you want to keep a record of, or you want to be able to compare what it looks like now and in another month or whatever, or you just want to brag to your friends. So those are just a few tips. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. And we're going to start to talk about weeds. Well, I don't have to tell you what a weed is. Of course, we read that it's a plant in the wrong place. Well, those weeds are a bit more than that, aren't they? They are strong. They compete extremely well with your precious vegetables because they've got usually quite good root systems. Look at dandelions, for example. And they do compete for the moisture in the soil when it gets dry, especially in our Virginia, Shenandoah Valley summers. It can get quite dry for quite a long time, and your weeds are competing for the soil, and they're shading your precious vegetable plants, and they're also gobbling up the nutrients in the soil. So weeds are really not a good thing. Having said that, and thinking how prolific weeds are on unmaintained soil, I mean, look at the roadsides and so on. Only 3% of all the plant species are in fact what we humans call weeds. So they really aren't as overwhelming as you would think. And when you get to know them, or when you manage to deal with them and prevent them, then life becomes a whole lot easier for you and for your vegetables. However, having said that, not all weeds are bad. There are some of the most delicious plant food, free and easily plucked. The one that perhaps is my favorite because it's the first one we see after the winter. I haven't seen any yet in my garden, which is very sad because we've had such severe ice out here and snow, and it's only just receding now. But wintercress is a beautiful little plant. It's a little rosette of green leaves coming up now, and it's delicious. It's just as good as watercress, and it's free, and it comes out in this pretty rosette, flattish on the garden. I just pluck it up by the root, snip off the root with my little snips in the garden, take a basin of them in, wash them out in the water, and then snip them into my garden salad. Oh, they're so good. They're so good. So do look out for wintercress. I think some people call it bittercress. I don't like to use that name because I don't think they're bitter at all. Of course, once the flower starts coming out, then I have to admit, they do turn a bit bitter. But if the flower is still a bud, they're still quite good. But you'll be surprised how nice that is. And if you don't have any, I'll give you some. And then you can contain it. Maybe you put it in a container. And it's lovely because normal winters, you can pretty much pick them, right in January. But I haven't seen any yet here in my garden. Chickweed is another one that's all over the place. And this little plant here that in my picture is a young chickweed plant, also very tasty and good for you, and very nice. It comes on a little bit later than the wintercress. Soon we'll see the wild violets, and later on yet purslane. Purslane is famed for being very rich in vitamin C of all things, so it's actually particularly good for you. And they all have good minerals and nutrients of various sorts, and they're free. The problem is you don't want them to overrun your garden, but I've never had a problem with these things overrunning the garden. You just hoe them when they're young. And of course, you've got other ones. I mean, I know that people boil up baby dandelion leaves and all kinds of things. I'm not very exotic with this, but you can add to the conversation if you have something that you really, really like and think it works very well. Okay, so maybe you do have a garden. Oh, I should mention, the lovely thing about container gardens, you don't have a problem with weeds. You're starting usually pretty fresh every year with new potting soil, which is weed free. And so you don't have what we have to do with the in-ground garden. And by and large, my experience of my raised beds is that, of course, I do suppress the weeds anyway, but I don't have as much problem with the weeding in the raised beds either. It's the in-ground garden where you really have to tackle what are you going to do to suppress those weeds, to take care of them. The key, of course, is prevention, just like it is going to be with insects and diseases. But with weeds, we don't often think about it. But now is the time to be prowling the garden and seeing what signs of weeds to come. Right now, there's probably not much in the way of weeds, insects, or disease. It's a good time of year in that respect, because nothing else is growing much either. But destroy those weeds when they're young. And that is certainly in this month and next month. And in order to do it when they're young, you can take a hoe to it. And that means you just disturb the top surface of the soil. You're not digging down deeply into the reservoir of weed seeds just underneath the surface. 2 or 3 inches down, and there's just ever so many weed seeds just waiting to come to brought near the surface so that they can grow for you. If you dug this particular picture, if you dug that soil and just left it exposed to the atmosphere, in another 2 months, it would be covered in weeds, probably. So hand tools and hoeing is really good when the weeds are young and baby. Now, there are some with tap roots like dandelions, dear old dandelions, and wild onions and wild garlic around here. There's another with the little bulbs. You want to get those bulbs before they proliferate underneath the ground. You will need a dandelion tool, which is just a trowel with a long spike. You just pull them out. And now again is the time to start watching. I'm amazed how quickly dandelions flower in the spring, in early spring. The best way to deal with weeds that have got away from you is to suppress them. Mulch is wonderful. If you cover your soil with a couple of inches of mulch, ground up leaves that you heard Deb speak about, my husband grinding my oak leaves. Oak leaves are just too tough to decompose fast enough for my liking. They mat too and make an impenetrable barrier sometimes if you leave them there. But leaves, ground up leaves are wonderful as a mulch. Old hay, or better, old wheat, straw is good. Pine needles, I have a source, a neighbor has pine trees, and he's been raking it up and giving me these great piles of pine needles. Again, that acidifies the soil, so you want to watch what you're doing with the soil test, as Deb was explaining to you. My favorite actually is wet newspaper and mulch. I have this last year, between the rows of my in-ground garden, I layered 6 to 8 sheets of newspaper, wet, covered with the mulch. And I'm proud to say that quite literally, I was not weeding, except occasionally a little bit here and there, all the way through till the fall. Amazing. It was very, very effective. And this spring I will go back, because a lot of that newspaper will have rotted down and enriched the soil below it. It's a great, great way of doing things. In the mulch, of course, I've been using things that rot down too, so that I'll just put another layer on top. A lot of people, and I did for years, use permeable plastic ground cover. It's black. It has little perforated holes in it so that the moisture, the rain, the snow, everything can melt and go through it. And but the weeds can't come back up. The only problem is you usually have to dispose of it. They talk about it being degradable, but it takes a while. And you've got strips of torn plastic stuff. And I don't mean to be discouraging, because it is an effective way of doing it, especially if you've got if you want to spend the money and if you want to, take the time to lay it, it's very effective and it's quicker than using this newspaper. Please avoid, to every possible degree you can, using herbicides to kill your weeds. Why? Only because basically they're toxic. We don't know how much will get into your edible leaves and fruit. And we have so many toxins in our environment as it is. The fewer you use, and they really aren't necessary. I can assure you, because goodness knows I had the weediest garden probably in Warren County. And now I don't. And I only use the wet newspaper and a little bit of mulch on the top. And by the way, I'm one of the people that goes to, I've made friends with the Rappahannock Electric Company and whatever it is, the utility company, and they are fantastic. They deliver great piles, great mounds of chips to me. All my paths are lined with wood chips, and now my flower beds are too, by the way. So, okay, we can go on to the next slide and start talking about insects. First thing to know about insects is that most of them are what we call beneficials. They are not, in fact, pests. Unfortunately, we tend to focus on the pests. We think we can spray them with something and get rid of them. Unfortunately, if you use spray, even if it's an organic spray, you're killing probably more beneficials than pests. Only 1 to 3% of the 1 million known species of insects are actually what we humans call pests. Pests, of course, are what are bad for our nice vegetables that we are trying to grow. Most of them are beneficials. We'll talk about how beneficial they are. They are pollinators and they are predators on little smaller insects, which we do not like aphids, for example. And so that the beneficial pests will gobble up the aphids and do a job for us, which we really like. So please avoid, the last resort is to spray. Even though I'm never going to recommend anything other than what we call organic sprays, still it's best to avoid it because inadvertently we may be killing some of the beneficials that we want to keep. Moving right along, next slide, please. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the best way of dealing with infestations of insects, which means that you've got many more than your vegetable plants can stand. Starting with the best way of dealing with them to the ones that you do win as a last resort. So the good thing to know about insects, since there are so very many of them, and certainly I can't get my head around all the different names and all the different species that they prey on, it is nice to know that by and large, different species of insects they want to eat different specific varieties of vegetables. That is, this one here in our picture on the right-hand side is a cabbage white butterfly. I think everybody who grows any kind of brassica, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, will know about the cabbage white butterflies. They're very pretty fluttering around in the garden, but unfortunately they lay eggs which turn into larvae which gobble up our beautiful leaves. So they are not really a favored insect. But they won't go and bother your bean plants. They won't bother your tomatoes, but they will bother every one of your brassica plants if you have a problem with them. So what do? You try to figure out a way that beneficial insects will deal with the ones that you don't want to have. And how do you know whether you've got a particular, in the case of the cabbage white butterfly, you see them fluttering around. But the other way is, of course, that you see that because you've been prowling around your garden, you see that your cabbage leaves have got big holes in them. And believe me, if they get really well started, the holes can be bigger than the rest of the leaves. So it is really an advantage to try and deal with them as soon as possible. How do you do that? Well, let's go to the next slide. As I've said already, the first thing, the first action, the most desirable is to attract beneficials. And beneficials too have specific varieties of flowers and plants that they favor. And this is why we talk about companion planting. You may have heard of that expression. All it means is that we try to plant amongst our vegetables particular plants that will attract butterflies for beauty and pollination, and insects, hoverflies, and in this case, lacewing bugs, and so on, that will, in fact, in this case, the lacewing loves aphids to eat, which is very nice indeed. But they are also pollinators, and so they will help to grow your fruits. They will flutter from one plant to the other and pollinate your fruiting plant, which is really very, very nice. So the first thing is to think about companion planting. In a nutshell, I would say the thing that there are 3 plants that I have profusely. They seed themselves in the garden. I don't have to do any work. Marigolds, French marigolds, nasturtiums are wonderful, and borage with its pretty blue flower and its cucumber flavored flowers and leaves is another excellent attractant, companion plant. And there are, of course, lists and lists of these plants, and it's most enjoyable to have these growing. I don't have to plant them because they seed themselves now, and I have to hoe some of them out because they're not where I want them, because they're too many, but I leave them in judicious places and at the tops and bottoms of my rows and in amongst things, it depends. And I have them also in my raised beds, by the way. And you can plant a marigold or 2 in every flower pot, and so on. So that this is really a wonderful way of doing this. This is the most beneficial thing to do. Second thing is to protect young plants. Young plants are most vulnerable. The better your plants, because you're a great gardener, the more resistant they will be to insect damage. So you have to protect those young plants with row covers if you must, if you see evidence on your prowling of damage starting. Hand picking. Most people say, ugh, that's just horrid. But you know, if you're prepared and know what you're doing, it's really not too bad. I'm looking at the time here, we've got to move along. So I have a basin of soapy water with a splash of hand dishwashing soap and a splash of Clorox, because sometimes if you're collecting stink bugs, it can get a little smelly. But if you have a little bit of Clorox, it takes the smell away completely. And I go around to my trellis, and the Mexican bean beetles and then the Japanese beetles get thrown into there. I look for egg masses of Mexican bean beetles, and I do that when I'm prowling, and it's really not too bad at all. You get sort of used to it. And you may not have these, you know, and for example, 2 years ago, I had so many Mexican bean beetles. Last year, I had none. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. So don't be discouraged by us talking to you about things that will interfere with the growth of your precious vegetable gardens. It isn't as if you're going to get infestations of lots of stuff all happening and attacking your garden. Not so at all. The other thing that you can do is spray aphids with a water stream. Perhaps not the best idea, because I'm not very much in favor of getting your leaves, your plants too wet, unless you do it first thing in the morning. Perhaps if you did it first thing in the morning, the plants would still dry off. Okay, on to the next slide, please. And minimally damaging pesticides. There are a couple of good organic pesticides that I do use from time to time. Neem is one of them. Neem has the advantage of also being a fungicide, so that if you have disease on some of your plants, which we'll talk about quickly in a minute, then you can use neem, thinking about it as a fungicide as well as an insecticide. Bear traps for snails work amazingly well. Iron sulfate, which is a very non-damaging chemical, mineral. BT is effective for caterpillars, and diatomaceous earth, or even ground coffee, old coffee grounds, does a bit of a job for snails and slugs. So we'll go on to the next slide quickly, please. Now we want to deal quickly with plant diseases. There are a host of plant diseases. It's more complicated, and there are not many remedies in the way of organic things. So that really, again, prevention is the most effective way of keeping disease at bay. And again, rather like the insecticides, the diseases favor certain plants. So you really get to know a few diseases for a few of your vegetable plants, and in time you will be able to conquer them. With any luck, you will not have very serious damage. Always remember that if you see a diseased leaf and you can tell it just looks limp, or it's wilting, or it's brown, it's not green and healthy looking, then probably nip it off. And if you have a whole plant in a group of plants, you may have to, and the plant is, really not surviving, take it out. Either dig it out or at least cut it off at root, at soil level. And that's the best way, unfortunately, to deal with disease. But disease is not usually much of a problem. And of course, right now, this early in the season, it's not a problem at all. It's not there yet. And if you have containers, I have never had disease on my container plants. And even on the raised beds, I have a minimal amount. So that's another advantage of those ways of growing. So avoid, if you possibly can, watering from the top. Lots of people use those spray things, and I see them in the fields, and not in Virginia as much as in Maryland. I worry about it because we have a hot, wet, humid climate as it is. The other little thing that I think is very important to remember, if you are tempted to crowd your plants because you just want more crop, it's not good, because it traps in the humid, moist air, which lets disease grow rapidly. And moving on to the next slide, there was a question about rotation of crops. And I will say that even though it's so difficult to rotate in a small garden, most of us do not have huge in-ground gardens where you can easily rotate. My garden was 30 feet by 30 feet. It's now, I'm going the other way from Deb. I'm getting smaller, not bigger, my age. But I'm having more raised beds and more containers. I haven't really given up many plants yet. I don't want to. But rotation, I do rotate my tomatoes because indeed the pathogens live in the soil. If you don't clean up in the fall, your dead leaves that are disease-ridden, they will infect the soil. And lo and behold, this time of year, those little pathogens sitting in unclean soil are going to come up and attack your lovely new young, vigorous young plants. So clean up. The other thing is that cleaning, if you're growing in pots, even in small pots, washing them out at the end of the season, using a disinfecting mixture of a little bit of bleach in water, something like 1 part of bleach to 10 parts in volume of water, is very effective. So those things are the best way to deal with plant diseases. And I'm looking at the time. I will just take the last slide that I have here, almost the last slide. This is a picture of a mildew infested squash plant at the very end of a season 2 or 3 years ago of mine. That's what it looks like. The mildew is there. Usually it doesn't actually hurt the fruit that it might do if it's this bad. Just to say in a nutshell, there are so many families of diseases. I am not an expert at all on them. And fortunately, I don't have to deal with a lot. And with any luck, you won't either. But prevention is way better to try and cure them. However, there are certain diseases that we do see every now and again, and there are fairly easy ways of dealing with them. You will, by the way, in common chat with your friends and colleagues, and maybe some of us in Sustainability Matters, we'll talk about blights and wilts and mildews, and those are just common names for rather more elegant names, fungi and bacteria and viruses. Again, just like for insects, plant families can get specific diseases. Tomatoes get blights, and blossom end rot is one that you can easily deal with by upping the calcium in your soil by sprinkling a little lime around it. Or some people use eggshells. That takes longer. If you put the eggshells around your tomato plants now, they would be supplied with sufficient calcium. You would not get blossom end rot. Mildews, squash and cucumber plants are a little bit vulnerable. But the other way to approach this is plant resistant varieties that are resistant to various diseases. And I would like to commend to you, looking at your plant catalogs that you get in the mail. Tomatoes are typically very prone to getting certain kinds of blights and so on. And this particular catalog actually says plagued by blight or spotted wilt virus, then try these varieties. And there they have a whole bunch of varieties, and they have a whole alphabet soup of letters next to them. And each letter, V, F, L, B, S, A, they all represent a disease to which they have bred these tomatoes to be resistant. And it is probably worth your while if you have a problem. If you're just starting out new and you're just trying things, don't worry about it. See what happens. But if you are already plagued with certain tomato diseases, then resistant varieties really do help a lot. And I can speak from experience. So there we are. Use your catalogs, use your plant labels, use your seed packet labels. And please, the last slide. Thank you very much for so nicely moving my slides along. I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. First of all, great gardeners, and you are all already, or at least potentially, great gardeners in whatever mode you want to garden for vegetables. You're continual learners. There is so much to learn. I grew up in a chemistry lab, didn't I? Everything was controlled. Mother Nature's not like that. She changes all the time. The climate changes, the soil changes, the wet or dry, even the nutrients in the soil and the insects, where did they come from? So we're continual learners, and I want to urge you to recognize that we learn from each other, and we at Sustainability Matters, we build consciously, and we intend to build community together so that we can all have really the best vegetable gardeners. So I am delighted now to hand over to Sari Clarke, who's going to tell you a little bit more about our resources, but I want to leave you with one last message, and that is happy gardening in 2022 to every one of us. Thank you so much. Goodbye.